Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Liberated Panda right here on Second Gen. Today, we have a very special guest joining us on Liberated Panda. Please welcome Jeremy Daum, the contributor founder of China Law Translate. He translates, writes, does web design, graphic design, billing, tech support, and social media outreach for China Law Translate. So a jack of all trades. So hello, Jeremy. How are you today? And thank you for joining us on Liberated Panda.
Hi, Angel. Thanks for reaching out. It's great to be here.
No, thank you for coming. I'm really looking forward to discussing China Law Translate. It's something that caught my eye as a fellow lawyer to lawyer. And I think what you guys are doing is very interesting. It's very, it's going to serve, I think, for the greater good. So I'm very glad you're doing this. So before we get into all of that, would you please tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, your background, and your involvement in how you got into China Law Translate in the first place?
Sure. I'm a research fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center, which is part of the law school, and I do have a JD degree from an American law school. And we do research projects that involve working with our Chinese counterparts, people who are practitioners in law, and other government officials, as well as lawyers and academics. And as a result of that, we have to understand the Chinese legal system fairly well to understand what the new issues are and where problems are that we might be able to help or that might be interesting to explore from an American legal perspective. China Law Translate really came out of that work in that we frequently are trying to introduce experts from the US and China to each other so they can share their experiences and learn from each other. And it may not surprise you that there's not so many American legal experts who are fluent in Chinese. Right. So we were frequently creating translations, and I sort of formalized the process through this website.
That's fantastic. So like you said, there's not a lot of people that are well-versed in both. Are you good in Mandarin and English as well?
My Mandarin in my mind is quite poor, but I'm better at reading and probably better at law than I am at daily conversation.
Wow.
I do have both of the legal systems, at least within the criminal procedure realm, which is what I mainly study. Other colleagues of mine at Yale study different areas of law, but I've been focused on criminal for about a decade now. So at this point, I'm starting to feel more like I understand the Chinese system than I understand the US system, honestly.
So let me ask you about the criminal judicial system in China. Is it a lot different from in America, or do they kind of model off each other in some form?
Both. They're very different, and they have a lot of inherent difference, starting with that the US is from a common law jurisdiction, meaning that we're from the British model of law, whereas China has a socialist legal system, which is a part of the civil law tradition, which most of Europe has, and theirs is heavily influenced by the Soviets. But the criminal procedure is really different. It's much more inquisitorial. The judge asks questions as opposed to an adversarial model, which we have in the US, where it's really the two sides arguing. There's no juries, which is really important to us in the US. Witnesses don't often appear, although they're working to fix that. But I don't want to say that they're totally different, because they do learn from each other, particularly China from the US. And that's where my role mainly comes in. China actively looks abroad for legal models that it might be interested in changing, adapting, or working for their situation. Most recently, they've taken something from the US that I wouldn't have recommended they take, our plea bargaining system. And they're working towards adapting that to the Chinese context. So China very actively learns from foreign models, sometimes for good, sometimes for less good. But it creates this opportunity for interaction amongst the global legal community.
So a lot of people say the American justice system is broken, and I'm a little bit, of that camp as well. I think it does need a bit of fixing, a bit of reform. So what do you think about contrasting the ability for the Chinese judicial system to carry out justice versus in America? Where do you see it panning out better?
Yeah, I mean, the US justice system is broken. There's no question. Like I said, plea bargaining is not a system I like. I think a lot of people admit to crimes by putting in a guilty plea, even if they don't feel they were truly guilty, and we don't have a system of trials anymore. The Chinese system is probably more broken, but it is improving itself, and it's rapidly. There is an active criminal justice reform there, which might surprise a lot of people to hear. A lot of people, when I mention I study Chinese criminal procedure, they say, doesn't that just mean whatever the government wants? And it's like, yes, but the government does have to be responsive to public opinion. That would be sort of the equivalent of saying, you study US policing, why bother when the police just do whatever they want? Well, maybe, but we're trying to fix that problem. These are issues of public concern. So in China's system right now, there's still some abuses of what we would consider fundamental rights. People can be detained for a long time before trial without, even though they're presumed innocent before trial. They might be detained for several months. 53% of people now, which is an improvement. Just 20 years ago, it was over 96%. So it's down already to 53 is an improvement, but that's, not great. And they can be interrogated repeatedly. Unfortunately, indirect forms of torture still exist sometimes. There's many problems that you'll read about in the US media even.
Right. No, that's absolutely true. So I guess with China Law Translate, when you translate everything to English, right, does it like draw international attention? As in, like, do you find like lawyers, like for like the Innocence Project or something, the ACLU, that equivalent, like going to China now because of China Law Translates, because they can actually see maybe some of the injustices that may or may not be happening?
Yeah, well, it lets people explore it at a greater depth than they've been able to. I mean, there have been people doing piecemeal translations for a long time, including the Chinese government sometimes themselves. And I should say that, my day job with the Yale Center, the Yale Paul Tsai China Center, is about bringing folks like from the Innocence Project and the ACLU over to China and helping them engage. But it's one thing to read a quick article explaining some injustice that's happening or a new rule and its possible implications versus getting to read the law and sort of see what it actually means. And yeah, I know you're trained in law as well. And you know that sometimes just reading a law on paper still doesn't really put it in context for you until you know what's happening in the courtrooms, what's happening in the law firms. So it's just a start, and we still have to do a lot of explaining, but it gives people a starting place to understand things. And not just with the rights issues, but I've had things where just for fun, we translated anti-doping laws. And I was surprised to see that a weightlifting magazine or website linked into us. And it was attracting a lot of attention from people who do international competitions that might end up in China.
No, that's interesting. So thank you for kind of like helping me transition to my next question, which has a lot to do with what you just said. So if you could please take us through the process of translating the Chinese legal documents to English. And what I mean by that, I mean like the people involved, right? The amount of people involved. How long does it take for a person to translate an entire like case law or statute? I know it depends on what the doc is, but would you please take us through that whole process?
Yeah, so our site allows people to sort of crowd translate, where people who are logged in can, so that it leaves a record of who did what translations, can translate as little as a single sentence or more. And it has a nice user interface to facilitate that. And so sometimes when it's a bigger doc, we've had people work in groups where people will claim a section and work forward. Often it's a core group, which is usually about 2 or 3 people at any given time, not very many at all. And we work through it. And originally I thought, well, because I'm in this field, there's probably a lot of people with interest in helping do a little bit of translation a day. I didn't realize what a demanding skill set requirement there is. Really the skill threshold requires you to understand both legal systems, not just both languages, in order to make distinctions between terms or to determine that the terms don't need a distinction. So we haven't ever had a huge team, but we do have people who come in for certain topics of interest to them. Someone's really interested in IP law, somebody's really interested in criminal or administrative law. And we work together slowly, and then I go through and review for terminology. We do have a glossary of terms, so we can try and help, it both helps standardize terminology in the translations, but it also, we work to put definitions with things so that it becomes a learning tool too. If you see a term in English or Chinese on our site that you don't know, you can type it in there and maybe get some context.
Is there always an equivalent? Like, for, I'm sure like statute of limitations, there's like an equivalence, but like, the other like more esoteric, like legal terms, like, is there a Chinese equivalent, or do you guys struggle with that?
Yeah, I mean, going both ways, you can have the problem where there's a term that doesn't really translate one-to-one. A critical thing that I've found is distinguishing terms that seem alike, but actually are different. So in criminal procedure, we have what we translate from Chinese as release on guarantee, and a lot of people want it to be bail, 取保候审. And this, literally it's collecting a guarantee and releasing for further investigation or trial. But we call it release on guarantee and not bail, because bail is a right that we have, and it should only be restricted in certain circumstances. 取保候审 is a restrictive measure that the police can employ to keep tabs on you pending their investigation. So while they both involve putting down a guarantee to get out of jail before trial, they're a little different. We want to distinguish that. Or the Chinese prosecutor's office is referred to as the procuratorate. Instead of just prosecutors, we call them procurators. And this is to acknowledge a distinction that they have functions beyond just prosecuting crimes. They're also the watchdogs of legality. They're supposed to find out if other government actors have done illegal things. So, we have to find ways to use English or Chinese to distinguish different terms. We don't want to mislead people by putting a false equivalency.
Right. And with the law, the nuance is so important. So it's very interesting that you're able to capture the nuance, right? Because even in American law, like sometimes a case law will come down to a comma, a misplaced comma. So yes, kudos to you guys for.
And as you know, the punctuation differences in Chinese versus English can sometimes be very confusing and ambiguous. You can't tell if this, the dunha is being used as an and or an or is it both? Right. Whereas English legislation tends to be a little more precise these days in its terms, especially at the federal level in the US, as opposed to some local Chinese governments might put out something that's not so well drafted. I actually was once approached by a group working in China's government talking about creating better translations, and I urged them to do them during the drafting process, not wait till there's a finished law, because a translator looks so carefully at language that they'll be able to point out ambiguities in the original language, in the Chinese, that you could fix. Not for the sake of letting people see the translation even, but to find these problems that might exist.
So are they heeding to your advice at all?
I know that I now, when I translate a draft law, because China does release its laws in advance for public comment before they're passed, whether they consider those comments seriously, I don't know, but they do request the comments, and someone reads them. So I submit comments now, but I don't think their internal processes about approval of translations are pretty rigorous, because they don't want to release a wrong translation. For a website, if we have a mistake, it's not fatal. For a government, it's a different thing. So I think they might do it internally. Certainly they understood the point, but I think their very limited translation staff might not be able to do things that quickly.
So that's fair enough. So I guess that leads us to our next question, which is what was your motivation behind providing these services in the first place? It sounds like such a demanding and difficult undertaking, and you're almost like a one-man show. I know you're not, but you're doing a lot. So it's like, what motivated you to start all of this?
It's ended up being more of a one-man show than I intended, but I do have some great colleagues and friends who work with me on it, so I won't take all the credit or the blame for any mistranslations. Originally the realization was that there were a fair number of organizations like our center at Yale that were creating translations and they weren't being shared. So people were doing redundant translations. Law firms would do them in the business area, but in things like criminal procedure and regulatory or rights-based work, they really weren't, they weren't getting put out on the web in an easy to find place. So I thought if we could centralize that and make it easy to collaborate through the user interface I mentioned before, we might have more people coming upon this material and pooling resources. And I personally, for my work, was using translations like this a lot.
Right.
So I encouraged others to do it. And the other aspect is, for a while, it was my Chinese language homework for the day. I would just do a few minutes of translation to get used to the legal language. And why not make something productive out of that? Gradually, like I said, because the skill threshold was pretty high for people to get involved, and it takes a fair amount of time to review other people's translation work, just as it does to translate. It came down to just a few core team members who have been consistent in contributing, but we always have a few students or things dropping by. So the use originally was for our own work, but now I've found that there's a greater need that a lot more journalists come to the site that I would have thought, and governments of other countries. I know that one of our translations was once used in a Swedish court case where they were considering extradition of somebody to China and wanted to see relevant laws. And there was no translation available other than ours. And ours is reliable, so they were able to present it. So things like that. And I know that a lot of embassy workers from various nations use our site and journalists. And we do, in addition to translation, provide explanation and articles as well. So hopefully some of that is also a useful resource to that kind of people or a draw.
Absolutely. So you actually answered my next question, which was what's your target audience? So you mentioned journalists, you mentioned the Swiss case, right?
Sure.
So other lawyers from other countries, and then what other people do you find like using your website a lot?
Yeah, so I mean, you can hardly open a U.S. newspaper or watch U.S. news these days without seeing China featured. And law also is a subject that touches on almost every other subject. So people have interest in Chinese legal topics, even people who aren't overly well versed in China's culture or political situation. So a lot of times when these stories come on, China is doing something new to regulate social media. Well, people read an article about it, of course, and get an idea, but then they want to see more of the language of that regulation. What does it actually say? And there is sort of a trope in reporting on China to find the most negative angle to portray things in. Honestly, I think this happens in other areas besides China, but it's particularly strong in China these days and regarding China these days in the US. And so I think sometimes seeing the original language, or at least a reasonable translation thereof, can help people to see, okay, so it does say this, but it doesn't necessarily say that. It helps people clear it up. China's legal system has many problems, but they do have laws, and increasingly so, that are meant to govern how the government itself applies rules. And sometimes seeing the original language of that is useful. And even if it doesn't interest one personally, it affects 20% of the world's population. So it's probably worth taking a look.
So I guess as a follow-up question, it's a two-parter. So as a foreign business person, or just a foreign person in general, if I were to get into a breach of contract, for instance, as a business, or a patent infringement, how strong is the judicial system in China to protect my interest as a foreigner, hypothetically, as a business person, or even someone that got hurt?
Yeah, so again, my primary research area is criminal, so it's a little outside my world. And even on China Law Translate, we avoid doing sort of business transaction translations because we figure the for-profits are happy to work on anything that involves money. But the answer is increasingly good. The courts are getting decent at dealing with these sort of day-to-day things. There are people who say still that there's some bias against the foreign party in a contract dispute. And certainly some laws, including food safety laws or employment laws, are applied more strictly when it's a foreign party, maybe to make an example of them without aggravating the citizens too much, but using it as an educational moment. But in the world of intellectual property, you'll now hear from some of the major players that they are winning cases in Chinese courts. There are specialized IP courts at the highest levels, so they have very good, well-trained judges, and you'll hear from practitioners that, yes, they're presenting evidence and winning cases. And those courts are also starting to use precedent, which other courts don't do, so that these cases then build on each other and establish rules. So there's still many of the problems that one has one perceives China's courts as unfair, but it's improving rapidly. And I think by and large, compared to criminal cases, civil cases are much less sensitive. They have less political ramifications. They're not about state power punishing. They're between two civil entities. So I think in a contract dispute or even an accident injury, you'll probably do a little better.
So I guess we can pivot to the criminal process in China, which you're more well versed in, right? Can you take us through from when a person gets arrested to being processed to getting into the system itself? Can you take us through all the details and how it differs from over here in America?
Yeah, it differs a fair amount. So by the rules, assuming the rules are happening, well, the first distinction that should be made actually is that what we mean by a crime. A lot of things that we call a crime in the US, in China, are considered to be an administrative violation. And that means that even things like drug possession, which makes up a really large percentage of minor crime cases in the US, in China is likely to be an administrative violation, where the police will handle it directly without going before a judge. You'll have a mini hearing inside the police department, but they can punish you up to 15 days of detention without going to a court. Now, 15 days is fairly reasonable, but there are these other administrative systems, including one for larger drug addiction problems where it can be years, which in a drug rehabilitation center, which involves labor after an initial period of detox. Those systems have gradually been being reduced with leaving the 15-day maximum for administrative punishment. And most of these things are settled with a fine, but they do for drug use, they do still have a larger administrative system. So even the definition of crime, it's important to remember that when you see crime data coming out of the country, how many people were arrested, for example, well, that could be about crimes. And crimes in China is probably something closer to felonies in the US. So things like indecent exposure, public nudity sort of things, administrative violation in China, not a crime. So once you're in the criminal process, the police believe there's a crime after they pick you up. Usually within 72 hours, they have to report to the prosecutors, the procuratorate, for approval to continue detention. And then the procuratorate will receive that, and they do, in the US, it would be a judge. you do a first appearance arraignment, and the judge would hear the case, decide if there is a case, and if there's not, say that you can't be held, maybe set bail. In China, it's the prosecutors. So they're the check on police power here. And they will review the case, make an initial determination, and authorize further detention or other what they call compulsory measures. There's one of those phrases that doesn't exactly translate.
Right.
But it's some method of restraint. It could be a house arrest equivalent. It could be release on guarantee, like I was mentioning earlier, or at the most severe, it could be arrest, which means you're kept in a facility. And then that period can go on for a very long time. We actually on our site, under references on the menu, have a timetable of how long everything can ask. And with the approval of the highest court, it can be indefinite. So there's so the initial hurdle is getting approval for continued detention, at which point it goes back to the police, either with the suspect in detention or not, and they'll continue their investigation until they think they have enough evidence to really prosecute. Then they go back to the prosecutors, who conduct a second review, more rigorous, to see if it'll make a case. And if they think this is a conviction, then finally it will go on to court, where it will be convicted, because basically once you're indicted, you're convicted in China, in the Chinese system.
Okay, so from my understanding, it seems like the barrier of entry, if we can call it that, of getting, arrested, which means you're indicted, which means you're in big trouble, it seems a lot higher than it is in America. But you're saying once you get to that level, then you're better off in America, right? Where you're getting more due process. But up until that point, it seems like China is almost like the more lenient option, but maybe I'm hearing you wrong.
No, it's not. I wouldn't say that. I mean, I wouldn't want to get in trouble in either system.
Right.
But I more wouldn't want to get in trouble in the Chinese system. So if it's the administrative violation, which the police will handle for those minor offenses, the most severe maximum penalty is going to probably be much lower than the US for things like the drug possession. But your rights are still less in China by a lot. For example, when you try and request an attorney, good luck with that. In China, people accused of crimes have the right to an attorney, but their attorney won't be present with them during interrogations. They can't be present with them. They won't get to read the case file until it's sent to the prosecutors to review for indictment. Your rights are almost always less in the Chinese system. Your penalty might be less in some cases, but that's mainly an artifact of the US having very severe punishments for many things like drug offenses, rather than it being about the Chinese system being lenient. But I think there's two separate questions, one about leniency and one about your rights in the system. And certainly your rights are better protected in the US system. Although we have workarounds, including plea bargaining, where you can forfeit those rights and feel pressured to forfeit many of your rights. But for example, search warrants, something that everyone from TV knows, and Miranda rights, right? The right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be used against you, that we all know from TV, even if we didn't go to law school. You don't have those rights in China. You don't have the right to remain silent in China, although some people argue that it exists as a result of other law. You are required to truthfully answer questions that are relevant to the crime. Search warrants are something that exists, but they're not given by an independent court. They're given by the police themselves to other police, or by the prosecutors to police. So, your rights are always better protected in the US system, and the ability to appeal is stronger in the US system. But the Chinese system, you may, in some cases like drug offenses, end up with a more lenient penalty. That's true.
I see. So do the police and the prosecutors, do they do they work together, or are they completely independent of each other and they don't take advice from each other?
So they're increasingly in China working together. It used to be that the criminal process was very much an assembly line, broken into clear phases: investigation with the police, prosecution with the prosecutors, and then trial with the court. And people used to say that the police pick the vegetables, the prosecutors prepare the food, and all the judge has to do is eat it. Meaning that the conclusion was already done before it got to court, where the verdict was just confirmed. But now, and of course, in those phases, like I mentioned before, the prosecutors might have some checks on police power, like approving further detention during investigation, that approval of arrest, and approving an indictment or asking for more evidence. But it's gradually shifting, where on major cases, the prosecutor should become more directly involved in working with the police on guiding the case and instructing them specifically on what evidence to be gathered and how to proceed, which is a little closer to a US model, that closer collaboration. But it's a gradual shift, and trial is gradually becoming more meaningful as well. At least that's the plan. The emphasis on having a true trial where there's contested facts is one of the major reforms right now. Unfortunately, as in the US, it's likely to be consumed by the plea bargaining system that they're borrowing from us in part.
So forgive me if this is a sensitive question, so feel free to feel like you don't have to answer. But for political reasons or whatnot, like if there's like political issues with leaders, right, and they decide that they don't like somebody, and they arbitrarily just put they said that he embezzled funds, or whatever BS charges that they stick onto that person. For that type of individual in the criminal judicial system in China, is there even a fighting chance for them?
If the political legal system has decided to be against you, no, there's not going to be much of a chance for you. But I don't think those cases are anything like the norm. They're exceptional when they happen. And there's two things that should be noted. There are political cases, certainly, like right now there's two Canadians being held who I believe it's a totally politically motivated case, and China's government hasn't put out much to let us think otherwise. And hopefully if they had a case, they would make that very clear. There's something called the Supervision Commission, which began in 2018 under the new supervision law in China, that allows them to, outside the normal criminal process, address corrupt officials or other state actors. It used to be all of these functions that were part of the Communist Party's Discipline and Inspection Commission, but they now put it as a government organ, party versus government. So now it's official government organ, where they have investigatory powers for officials' misconduct, including corruption, including abusing office for personal gain, or derelicting your duties, where before it even goes to the criminal system, they have this extrajudicial detention and interrogation procedure that can be dealt with. So while, yes, there may be sometimes politically motivated cases, I think that's actually on the decline, because there's other outside the criminal justice system ways of addressing that if the government decides it's against you. I wouldn't want to be in any country where the higher powers have decided. But at the same time, these can act as a check against local officials taking vengeance against individuals in their area, because the central government may occasionally have a case that's politically motivated, but you're more likely to see that kind of petty vengeance down at the lower levels of government, just like you hear about with police forces, right, are more likely to be at the local level, when our DOJ might be a check on that sort of local corruption. So the Supervision Commission, in theory, is supposed to be a check on people abusing their authority in that sense. The problem is, who supervises the supervisors?
Right.
They are entitled to extrajudicial detention powers, which is quite frightening.
So would you say it's a kind of analogous to the American military judicial like tribunals where they have free reign outside our regular American judicial system?
Yeah, it's a little bit worse than that. I mean, there are martial courts in China as well. The Supervision Commission is now essentially a branch of government. And so it's on equal footing with the courts and the procuratorate. And it's nominally under the legislature of China in that it's supposed to report to them and be supervised by them, but it's also the members of the legislative representatives are also subject to supervision. So it's a strange sort of check and balance where one of you has investigatory powers of detention and the other receives reports. So it really is in many sense above or parallel to the whole criminal justice system and law, whereas martial courts, have a series of checks and balance and are of course subject to the Constitution and the high laws of our country.
Okay, no, thank you for answering that question. That was really helpful with that distinction. So you mentioned the two Canadian citizens being detained in China right now. Do you have any updates on that? And are they like planning to like let them go any soon? Are they having any sort of due process?
So even in cases, and I'm willing to say that, yeah, of course, there's politically motivated cases sometimes. There's usually a fig leaf of legality held on to, where at least at some level, the formal procedures are being followed. So, they've been held in, at first they were held in, I think, hotel rooms under one of the compulsory procedures, residential surveillance for people who don't have a fixed residence. You can sometimes be sent in a residence, quotes unquotes, that the police have selected for you, and in pretty bad conditions. But what I have is largely coming through the mainstream media and whatnot. We hear now a buzz that they're planning on moving forward with the trials, but even evidence or charges hasn't been made very clear thus far. We've heard that there are espionage or subversion charges made, but we haven't heard much about the cases. And there have been a few comments that, while not flat out saying it, do strongly suggest that this is just a political hostage diplomacy being made.
Yeah, no, totally agree. No, so thank you for that insight. I don't want to take up too much of your time, so I want to jump back into, the China Law Translate and my final two questions, which was, what are you hoping to accomplish with this service, your long-term goals?
Yeah, I mean, I hope to make China more accessible and less mysterious than the mainstream press seems to be doing it. And law is my field, so I hope that by making the law accessible, we can do some of that. I think there's a tendency to sort of obfuscate what's actually happening in China, and that Americans really have a pretty mistaken view of what living conditions are over in China. And I think that this hurts America as much as it hurts China. I think that what happens is a lot of Americans who have this very negative image of what's going on then go to China, see that it's relatively free and open, or at least compared to what they thought, and then get an equally misguided, optimistic impression of what China is like. We used to jokingly call it Marco Polo-itis, where people get wowed by how different it was than what they expected. And I don't think that's good for us either. What we should have is a clear and objective understanding. And that includes in the legal system, where we should understand what progress is being made, what faults still exist, and what issues need to be resolved together. We're talking to each other via Zoom in different parts of the US right now. The world is more and more on our computer. Crimes, not just physical crimes of human trafficking, need to be addressed together, but environmental offenses cross borders, and internet fraud is a huge issue, child pornography. These are things we need to work on together. and understanding each other's legal systems is going to be important to that. In addition, of course, to all the business law that I was saying I usually shy away from, where, let's face it, despite all the talk of decoupling, the economies are pretty seriously linked at this point.
Right. Yeah. So you think the decoupling process is pretty, it's very difficult, right? Because I read like 95% of the foreign manufacturing sector does not want to move out of China. I read that last week. So yeah, I think you're right that I don't think decoupling is very high on many businesses' priorities list.
It's certainly low on businesses. I mean, it's a governmental concept, right? And while it might be a governmental aspiration, in my experience, corporations are motivated solely by profit and savings. And to them right now, relocating would be an enormous expense. And unless the cost benefit analysis shifts a lot for them, they're not going to change their views. And of course, you know, consumers might decide that certain rights issues in China are severe enough that they're not going to buy products made there. But right now, just looking at what I'm wearing and the equipment on my computer desk, almost everything is connected to China in some way, shape, or form. So I just don't think it's realistic to decouple. I think the world is getting this, despite anti-globalists' aspirations, I think the world is getting more connected, not less.
Right.
And we have the two largest economies, right? Or two of the largest economies.
Right. So I guess you're saying that it's more like we just have to like learn to cooperate with each other somehow, right?
Well, we're major. The U.S. and China are major powers here on our planet, and neither of them has the ability or interest in doing away with the other. So, you know, we're going to have to learn to at least deal with each other to that extent. And that doesn't mean not criticizing each other. People and governments should always criticize where there's something worth criticizing. But we do have to recognize that China is there and has its own interests and its own logic. And part of that involves the legal system. And I do think that one of the things that surprises people who aren't familiar with China is the relative degree of legislative transparency that China has. While the laws might be vague, it's not always hiding the ball. They're usually pretty clear about what they want to do, even if it's something you disagree with. You know, I'm a strong proponent of freedom of speech as an American. I think Hillary Clinton said that's our brand once, you know, is freedom of speech. And China has strong limits on speech, but it's not a secret that there's strong limits. They put it out there. They'll pass a law about mocking the national anthem or flag, about, you know, defaming martyrs, where you can get jail time for that. And they spell out clearly that that is something that you're going to be punished for. So there are many unknowns in the law, but I think the intentions tend to be actually laid fairly bare. You know, that this is an area where, yes, we're going to retain the right to punish you for speech offenses. And I think that seeing the actual law can help make that clear, good parts and bad parts.
No, completely agree. So I just want to thank you, Jeremy, for providing this amazing service through China Law Translate. We plan to put the website in our description. I'll put your Twitter page as well, so everyone can, you know, hop on and learn more about it. So before we go, is there anything else you would like to tell our viewers about China Law Translate, or just anything else in your life?
No, I'm really glad to have this interest in the site and in what's happening in China generally. You know, it's forever changing at a speed that's hard for us to comprehend. And that means that the bad things can pass and the good things can develop. And, you know, we think of law as an inherently stable and conservative institution. But in China, it's a rapidly evolving one, and it's really one of the greatest shows on earth. So I do encourage everyone to join us on China Law Translate and where other places that we've been publishing to read stories about what's happening.
Right, and you're on the forefront of doing that. So thank you very much.
Doing our best.
So thank you for joining us today. We hope you come back on again when you have like more news, and best of luck with China Law Translate. I am going to be on the lookout for it and, keeping tabs on you. So I'm very excited for what's in store for you in China Law Translate. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Angel. I appreciate the interest. Yeah.
And have a great day. And to our viewers at home, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Liberated Panda right here on Second Gen. And we hope to see you next week. Have a good day. Bye.